Hello, everybody. Hello, and welcome back to Take a Break with History, coming to you live from Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago. If it's on our shelves, it's history. My name is Bjorn Skaptison, and I am the host for today's event here at Take a Break with History. Now, a little wrinkle to today's event. You may already see that I am not alone here. So this is not just a Take a Break with History. This is also a House Divided appendix version, or a House Divided Part 2, or commentary on our recent House Divided. Yes, you can see I am here with our special guest, David Powell. Thank you for joining me today, Dave.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Now, what we're going to do today for the next few minutes is we are going to review a little bit of the House Divided interview that David and I did last Saturday on his new book about the Atlanta campaign. The Atlanta campaign, Dalton to Cassville, May 1 through 1864. David's going to talk about that in just a minute. But also, our next step is it is something that reveals more of what we do here at Abraham Lincoln Bookshop and what we use Take a Break with History, this live stream, for, and that is to talk about antiquarian material. That is to talk about rare books. That is to talk about the stuff of value that comes out of history. And so the theme for today is we are going to review the memoirs of the leading figures of the Atlanta campaign. And since David has been living with these figures pretty closely for the last few years, we are going to get his hot takes on the various memoirs of the various commanders. We're going to get to that in just a minute. But first, here, let me share a little something and make sure I'm on the right screen here. This is going to involve a slideshow today, folks, and so it's going to be very entertaining. So David is the author of the Atlanta campaign, Dalton to Cassville, May 1 through 19, 1864. This is volume 1 of the Atlanta campaign. So before we talk about the memoirs, Dave, why don't you tell us a little bit about this book and give anybody who's watching it, who may not have been watching last Saturday, an overview of what you're trying to do with this project. How many volumes will it be? What's it going to cover?
Well, I wanted to explore the Atlanta campaign in a lot more depth than it has been before. So this project specifically is going to entail a total of 5 volumes. The first volume is out. And each volume is going to kind of center on a month or a specific battle. For instance, volume 2 will cover the action around New Hope Church up through the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain. Volume 3 will take us across the Chattahoochee to Peachtree Creek, which is July 20, 1864. Volume 4 will cover the fighting around Atlanta itself, which involves the July 22nd famous Battle of Atlanta and also the July 28th Battle of Ezra Church. And then finally, we will deal with Sherman's efforts to isolate Atlanta with cavalry raids and ultimately culminate with the Battle of Jonesboro, which severs the last rail link. So a total of 5 volumes. May, June, July, and August, ends early at the beginning of September.
Right, and there really hasn't been anything of this scale on the Atlanta campaign before, has there?
No, there's still what I still consider a very good single volume history by Albert Castell, Decision in the West, but that is now 30 years old, and more importantly, I don't see myself as replacing Castell. I see myself as supplementing Castell, because with 5 volumes, I can introduce the perspective of a lot more of the participants. I can discuss a lot of the maneuvers in detail. Volume 1, for instance, covers the Battle of Resaca in multiple chapters, whereas Albert Castell could really only afford to give it a limited amount of space. So I see it as broadening the scope, and going a lot deeper in places where he could not afford to. Uh, but but ultimately, we'll get to the same place, the fall of Atlanta.
Yeah, yeah. You're just taking the longer route. You're like Uncle
Yes.
Billy, keep going around the right. Anyway, folks, I'm going to put a link in our comments to where you can order a first edition copy of the Atlanta campaign. David has already been to the shop and he signed these first edition copies. And they're selling very quickly. Ours are almost sold out, David. And I know that you've heard from other retailers and from your publisher that this book is very popular.
It's moving very quickly. Yes, it's
Yeah.
very popular.
Okay, well then let's drill down to what we want to talk about, the deep dive, the going down the rabbit hole part of the discussion that we could not have done on last Saturday at A House Divided. And that is one very specific part of a bibliography that for you runs pages and pages and pages and pages of books and primary sources and manuscript material and digital archives, digital materials, things like that. Now, we're going to talk about one very specific kind of resource that historians have used from the beginning of the study of this topic. And these resources have dominated the history books that were written previous to this one because they are the words of the commanders. I'm talking about memoirs of generals. And here, let me put up a picture of some of them that we're going to talk about today. There's a pretty picture. We are going to talk about today the memoirs of General Sherman, the commander of all the Union forces, and then the narrative of military operations by Joseph E. Johnston, the commander of the Confederate forces during the first part of the campaign, and Advance and Retreat by John Bell Hood, the commander of the Confederate forces in the later part of the campaign. Now, the fact that we only have a few minutes today, 20 minutes plus extra time, if you will, then we are not going to be able to touch on other memoirs that are equally important, or as something David might want to comment on in a few minutes, the people that did not leave us memoirs that might have been important. A couple of examples I'm going to show you. We have a copy, a really nice copy right now, first edition of copy of the autobiography of Oliver Otis Howard. It's a 2-volume autobiography, and General Howard commanded the 4th Corps during a large part of the battle of the campaign, and then later in the campaign, he commanded the Army of the Tennessee. That was after the death of General McPherson. We also have a copy of Thomas Van Horn's History of the Army of the Cumberland. General George H. Thomas did not leave us a memoir. He might have wanted to, but he died young. And we'll ask David about that in a moment. But he did leave what we might call an approved history of the Army of the Cumberland. And when Thomas Van Horn talks about the actions of the Army of the Cumberland in his book, we can presume that that is largely the opinion of General Thomas. Although I'm going to give you a second here to rebut that if you wish to, David. The first thing I want to ask you about is, what is the value of memoirs? Never mind the exact ones we're going to talk about. Those are going to be in a minute. What's the value of memoirs in creating a campaign study like this?
Well, almost all memoirs are extremely important, simply because they offer us the only way. We can't interview these subjects. We can't go into a great deal of personal communication. But we have the memoirs, and in some cases we have their correspondence and other things. But the memoirs specifically bring us the reflections of the participants on events, especially if they've had a chance to interact with other participants in those same events. And so we get a narrative that develops in a way that, even though you could argue that, say, a letter written the day of the event, a primary source, can be more valuable than a memoir. But often there are things that don't go into a letter, or it's not essentially a discourse on the thoughts of the person involved. So So memoirs are a vital part of anything a historian does. But of course, we can't rely on them to the exclusion of everything else
Right. They
because,
have, obviously, it's great for William T. Sherman to tell you what he thinks happened, but there's a pitfall in believing him uncritically.
yes,
Mhm.
yes, because it's a narrative of uh, how they want to appear in front of history, not just how they actually appear. And
Mhm.
so often we come into circumstances where something doesn't fit quite right, or in cases we get into outright deception.
Right. We might talk about that in a moment. Yeah, the first memoir I want to talk about is right over here, and I'm going to go ahead and reach back and grab it and carefully bring it out here because it's a very nice, very pretty volume. This is an all leather set of what's called Advance and Retreat. It is the memoir. That's what we'll call it. It's what we'll call it, and I'm gonna stick to it. This is the memoir of John Bell Hood, the second commander of the Confederate forces, Army of Tennessee, and the Confederate person who's probably most closely attached in history to the failure of the Atlanta campaign from the Confederate point of view, the loss of Atlanta. And he did not, and so he felt like he had a lot to explain in history. Now, an important thing that I know you're going to get to in just a second here, David, is that John Bell Hood did not live to participate in a discussion in the memoirs. He did not live long enough to respond to what Sherman had to say or to what Johnston had to say. He died young, and Advance and Retreat was published by uh, after his death by General G.T. Beauregard. Hood had died in New Orleans, and so his writings were published by someone else after he died, but the book comes to us as a memoir. So, uh, so what's your take on Advance and Retreat, David?
Well, in one sense, he did get a chance uh, to respond. What he's Advance and Retreat is largely as a response to some of the earlier writings of Joe Johnston about the first part of the campaign, and so it's part memoir, uh, part I don't know what you'd call it, uh, uh, part accusation.
Douglas Southwell Freeman calls it sad and bitter.
Well, in some ways it is,
Mhm.
but also, it's an attempt to save his reputation after it was very badly savaged by Joseph E. Johnston. So it's really one half of a conversation, of a written conversation that we're hearing between Johnson and Hood.
Right, right. Do you have any opinion on whether Beauregard plays a role in gives a voice to this conversation, being the publisher?
My understanding is that he doesn't have much input the uh, into the contents. He plays a role as publisher. Hood and his wife have died, I think, in late 1879 or early 1880. I think it's published in 1880 from typhoid, I think.
Yellow fever, I think.
Yellow fever. Yeah, that's right. And so then there becomes this big push to get the book published. I think it's published even by the Hood Memorial Association, if I'm not
That's true.
mistaken.
That's true. I
So
checked. It's 1880 is when it
yeah,
came out. Yeah. Mhm.
and there's also a campaign to raise money for the Hood orphans. There are about 5 children, I think, left orphaned. Um, so Beauregard is very influential in that, but I don't think he has much input into the content or has an editorial hand in the manuscript that I know of. At least I've
Right.
never read any of that.
But the overall, so what you're saying is the overall point of Hood putting pen to paper in the first place is to respond to Johnston.
Yes, Johnston has written, I think, in the early 1870s. There are some articles that appear. Eventually, the article in Battles and Leaders
Mhm.
um, that opposing Sherman's advance. Johnston wrote that. Then the memoirs are published, and not unnaturally, Johnston blames Hood for everything. He blames Hood for going behind his back to President Davis. Johnson, in his memoir, claims that he only lost 10,000 men uh, before Hood took over for that period of Dalton to July 17th. Um, and Hood is outraged at that. And actually, there's a fair amount of primary source evidence uh, to to suggest that Hood was right. Johnson lost closer to about 20,000
Right.
men, twice as many as his narrative claimed.
Now we are
Um,
on to clearly for the folks at home, we are on to the Johnston memoir right now.
yeah,
So I'm going to catch us up. It is called Narrative of Military Operations. It's by General Joseph E. Johnston. There is our first edition copy. It was published in 1874. And it and our first edition copy is it isn't the greatest, but of course that's it. It was a you can see it's modeled there. It's an ex-library copy, but you can see what you got on the bookshelves at that time. A beautiful large volume with gilt lettering on the Confederate flag and a cannon on it. And clearly here is General Johnston telling exactly what happened. Um, and in the Atlanta campaign, and he's going to talk about Hood, and he's going to talk about his opponent, General Sherman.
yes, and perhaps we should take a step over to General Sherman's memoirs.
Mhm.
Uh, yeah, Hood and Johnson. Johnson's primary focus is Hood. Hood's primary focus is Johnson, but at some point they both will turn their attention to Sherman. And
Mhm.
Sherman does have in his memoirs, which I think Sherman will mention periodically, having personal conversations with Joe Johnson shortly after the war and things where they talk about their various campaigns.
Mhm.
Um, and Sherman's memoirs, like Grant's, have largely been regarded as high level gold standard, not by everybody. I think Dr. Castell, who I mentioned before, who wrote also wrote an article critical of Sherman's memoirs called "Prevaricating Through Georgia."
It
Um,
was
but
always fun
but
to it was always fun to read Albert Castell's writing.
yes, so uh, and Sherman does the same thing in a way that the other two do. He's trying to polish his apple the best. He omits certain things. Many of the veterans in the Army of the Cumberland, especially, were when they read his memoir, were quite upset that he didn't talk, for instance, about the Battle of Pickett's Mill. Didn't mention it at all. It was an action fought in late May that cost 1,700 federal casualties. An assault by two divisions of Union troops. Sherman just skipped right over it. And so uh, there are obviously things in Sherman's memoirs, um, an interesting confrontation with John Bell Hood, uh, for instance, in June of 1864, after the Battle of Kolb's Farm, where Sherman takes Hood to task, and I'm sorry, uh, Joseph Hooker. Did I say Hood? Joseph
Yeah,
Hooker
yeah.
takes Hooker to task for exaggerating the size of the rebel force attacking him, etc. And we have to go to yet another memoir, which we don't have time to talk about, but I will mention briefly. John M. Schofield, who is one of the subordinate commanders, Schofield, writing like 1904, many years after all of these other men are dead, Schofield essentially completely refutes Sherman's point of view in his memoir. So these are all fine examples of why you have to treat memoirs carefully. You have to vet them. Uh, they're useful, they're valuable, and certainly I quote from them. But uh, I also draw in other material that either bolsters that claim or refutes the specific claim. So
Right. It's a good starting place.
yes,
Mhm.
and and Sherman, just as an aside, Sherman is in many ways my favorite Civil War soldier. Not because I admire him, uh, I do admire him, but uh, he's just so quotable. All of these other men are carefully editing their thoughts. Sherman, in his letters, in his dispatches, and in his memoirs, if there's a thought, it just comes out.
Yeah.
And so we get some of the most interesting turns of phrase, so some of the most interesting reading material comes from William T. Sherman.
Now, one of the things I want to point out about Sherman's memoirs is, of course, here's a picture of I showed a picture before of the boards. Here's a picture of what they look like on the spines. And uh, this is the edition of the Memoirs of W.T. Sherman, published by the Charles L. Webster Company. Green cloth with the shoulder straps on the spine with 4 stars, because he was eventually full general, general of the army after the war. However, folks should understand that what we're looking at here, and what David may well have used as Sherman's memoirs, is the 1, 2, 3, count them, 4th edition of the memoirs. So Sherman, one of the characteristics of General Sherman is I don't think he ever likes to stop fighting. As soon as he published his first edition of the memoirs, it was criticized in print by Henry Boynton, who I know you know from the Chickamauga campaign. And so Sherman revised his memoirs and wrote another version. And so what
Right.
we're looking at here is the 4th and final edition of Sherman's memoirs, published by Charles Webster as part of what's called the shoulder strap series. All of the books have shoulder straps, and it's an attempt by the Charles Webster Company to get memoirs either of or about all of the great Union generals in the Civil War. And the first edition of Grant's memoirs looks just like that. It's in the green cloth with the shoulder straps, and it's memoirs of W.T. Sherman. And then there's McClellan and Sheridan and a lot of other people, published by Charles L. Webster. Charles L. Webster is a relative, I believe, the husband of the niece of Mark Twain. Mark Twain is the capital behind the series.
Sure.
But certainly Sherman and Grant and McClellan all, rush to have this publisher publish their version of their memoirs. Now, David, I don't want to ambush you with this question. Did you happen to consult any other editions of Sherman to see if he said one thing in volume, in the 2nd edition versus something else in the 3rd edition?
I did not in much detail. Mostly, what I was doing was comparing his contemporary writing, which are his letters to his wife, and the dispatches in the official records, and then his report, which is written at the close of the campaign. So it's not as immediate as a letter, but it's if written within a few months of the events. And then with the and there are some other articles that he's written.
Right.
Uh, and but the work is so voluminous for Sherman, especially,
Right.
that one thing I have learned in writing even the largest series, the most massive project, you always have far more material than you can use, or at least I do. And I didn't do like a textual criticism of the various editions. I think that
Right.
would be interesting.
It would be
Um,
interesting, but at this point, if you're going to find out what Sherman wanted you to think he did and why he did it, you would go to the last version he wrote, which
Right.
is the shoulder strap edition,
The shoulder
the
strap.
Webster edition. Yeah.
I the online edition that I use most, that I downloaded, it's public domain now, so
Mhm.
Internet Archive, um, is not actually the shoulder strap edition. I don't think. I'd have to go
Oh,
check it,
okay.
but but I do have reproductions of the shoulder strap editions for several of the John Grant, uh, um,
Yeah. The
Sherman
Grant
Memoirs.
and Sheridan and a lot
Right.
of the others. Yeah. They're great books. They're great books. And for collectors, it's a series that is extraordinarily hard to complete. It's extraordinarily hard to check all those boxes.
To get them all. Yeah.
Yeah, I've been in the rare book trade for 20 years now, and I've seen two or three full sets of shoulder straps.
As a
Um,
quick aside, what is the hardest volume to obtain?
the hardest volume to attain is Hancock.
Ah,
Elmira Hancock's memoir of her husband, Winfield Scott Hancock. And the vast majority of them that you do find have, for reasons that I don't understand, have never been explained, do not have a shoulder strap on them. So if you're trying to collect the set and you have to fill it out and settle for a Hancock that doesn't have a shoulder strap, then you're going to have a little, you're going to have
again,
something in. Yeah, yeah, you have an old maid in your set there, just holding its place until you hope someday one of those rarest of the rare events occurs, a copy of Hancock with the two-star shoulder strap appears.
just as one more quick aside,
Mhm.
we're talking about Sherman's memoirs. I'm sure you've seen the annotated edition of Grant's memoirs that were published a couple of years
Oh
ago by
yes.
John Marzalek. Um, I find those pretty interesting. If I go to the memoirs now, I go to that. It would be nice, if some ambitious professor or student undertook to do the same with Sherman's memoirs. The
Oh,
annotation has been very helpful.
oh yes, I think so. And probably the Marcellak version, although John Marcellak wrote that with several of his
Yes, yes,
uh, colleagues, and I now have it. David Nolan and Louis Gallo helped him. Thank you, Daniel. Um, yeah, this would be the finest modern version to buy, which of course is $39.95 in print versus about $750 for a first
right.
edition of Grant's memoirs. But this would be the finest, in my opinion, the finest version of telling the story of how Grant's memoirs came to be.
Right. I
The
agree.
race with death and his interactions with Charles Webster and Mark Twain's role, and how so much myth is built around Grant's memoirs, especially with Twain having money behind the project. It made a generation of people claim without any evidence that Mark Twain helped write
Right.
the
Right.
book. He did not, in case anybody's out there still thinking of that. It's Grant. It's Grant that wrote it and Twain that paid for it. Um, all right, we're just about out of our time, Dave, except I want to look at another uh, I don't know how to explain it, but another rare set of out of print antiquarian books that are just really hard to get in the first edition. And those are the Chickamauga Campaign by David A. Powell. Um, I we may have to talk in some other format, David, how it is to live to see your own work become a rare book.
It's uh,
but
it's very
but
humbling. I tell you that.
yeah, yeah. But these are the David did previously write a three-volume history of the Chickamauga campaign, and which supplemented by at least two other books, Failure in the Saddle and the Maps of
Right.
Chickamauga, and they are really hard to find now. And it is because they are so popular, and it is because they sell so well, and all of that is because they're so good. Yet tell us a little bit, just in a couple of minutes, an elevator pitch on the Chickamauga campaign, a three-volume history that was just about your introduction to Civil War writing.
Right. I had agreed to do the maps of Chickamauga Savas Beatty Publishing, and I had an ambition at that time that was Maps of Chickamauga was my first book, so I wasn't published before. I'd done some articles, but I kind of casually mentioned to the publisher, Theodore Savas, that I'd like to I'd really like to do a 3-volume history of Chickamauga. I'd like to do a narrative volume for each day, and we count September 18 as a day.
Mhm.
It didn't quite come out to a book per day, but it does cover the entire campaign from the crossing of the Tennessee River in late August up through the retreat into Chattanooga on September 24th, 1863. And the middle volume, Glory or the Grave, is literally just the fighting on September 20th.
Yeah.
So the focus is much the same with the Atlanta campaign, to bring out the narrative voices of the participants as much as possible, to do a real in-depth tactical study of this one battle, because while there had been previous books on it and good books, I felt that there was still room to do a great deal more. And I mentioned that I wanted to do this series, but I said, well, no one will ever publish it. And a few months later, after thinking it over, Mr. Savas called me back and said, let's do it. I think he was very happy with Maps of Chickamauga at that point, and that's what we did. So
Excellent.
It also helps to reassure people when I say 5-volume history of the Atlanta campaign. Oh my God, when will this be done? Will he ever finish it? I can finish a long series.
Yeah, you have proof that you could finish a long series.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm going to put a link into the comments where you can learn more about our set of signed first editions of the Chickamauga campaign. Also links to every other book that we talked about today, Sherman, Grant, and Hood, and a chance to buy the Atlanta campaign. Hey, we are more than out of time, David. So thank you very much for joining us and spending more than the amount of time that
Sure, no
you
problem.
agreed. And I want to thank everybody at home for joining us on Take a Break with History. We will see you again in 2 weeks. We're going to see you right here. Thanks a lot.